Today's program is part of the award-winning series Profiles in Literature, featuring interviews with persons prominent in American literature for children. The moderator of this series is Dr. Jaqueline Shachter Weiss.
Profiles in Literature is proud to present an author of prize-winning nonfiction for young people, Russell Freedman. Thanks for traveling from Manhattan today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Jacqueline.
My Profiles colleague is Carolyn Field, Coordinator Emeritus of the Office of Work with Children of the Free Library of Philadelphia.
Great to be here again.
We'll share a few of our guests' personal photos by way of background input. From the jacket of your Cowboys of the Wild West comes this picture of you as a young cowboy. About how old were you?
I guess I'm about as old as I look in that picture. I don't remember the year it was taken. It was taken by one of those itinerant photographers who had a camera and a pony and who went from house to house.
Well, about 210 years later, we see you in your studio. There isn't a visible computer. Do you use one?
No, I don't use a computer, nor do I use an electronic typewriter or an electric typewriter. I use a manual typewriter, a Humphrey Bogart-style Underwood. I bang out the manuscripts.
And our final photo shows you relating to pupils. Where was it taken?
That was at an elementary school in Sacramento, California. I spent a week in Sacramento. I think I visited 8 schools, 2 a day, and I spoke to and with the kids at each school.
And you are originally from San Francisco,
I'm from
aren't
San
you?
Francisco, where the cowboy picture was taken.
I see. Before we discuss your already published books, do tell us what you're currently working on.
I'm working on 2 books at the moment. I'm just finishing a biography of Franklin D. Roosevelt, which will be published by Clarion Books next fall, and I am beginning work on a book about the Wright brothers, using their own glass negative photographs and excerpts from their journals. That book is not actually a biography. It's a description of how they conceived, built, launched, and flew the world's first airplane.
Who will publish it?
That will be published by Holiday House.
One of the reasons that you're so popular, you know, is because your book, Lincoln, a photo biography, won the 1988 John Newbery Award. How many copies of that have they sold?
As of this morning, about 100,000.
Wow. How does it feel to be one of the very, very few nonfiction writers to win a Newbery Medal?
It feels quite wonderful, and I was flabbergasted when I learned about it. I didn't realize that a nonfiction book was eligible until they notified me. I should have known it, but I hadn't stopped to think about it.
In your Newbery acceptance speech, you cite award bias for fiction with this description: upstairs, imaginative fiction dwelt grandly in the house of literature. Downstairs, hard-working, utilitarian nonfiction lived prosaically in the servants' quarters. But wasn't it a work of nonfiction that first won the Newbery Medal?
It was. The Story of Mankind, Hendrik van Loon, won the first Newbery Medal in 1922, but since then very few nonfiction books have won the Newbery Medal, or for that matter, any major award. And I think children's literature went through a long period when nonfiction was not considered authentic literature, not considered worthy of awards. That's changed considerably in the past few years, but yes, it was definitely dwelling in the servants' quarters for a long time.
I'm sure you did a little research, and what is the major category of the other nonfiction winners?
They're all, with the exception of The Story of Mankind, they're all biographies, surprisingly. or
Well,
perhaps not surprisingly.
How do you think that biographies for children have changed in the last few years
Oh, they've
from
changed.
the early ones?
They've changed dramatically. For a long time, there was a tradition in children's literature among biographies where the subject of a biography was given very reverential, adulatory treatment. The subjects of biographies were idealized. They were, in fact, sanitized. They were presented as paragons that were often hardly recognizable as human beings. Thanks to a lot of people like Gene Fritz and Milton Meltzer, who have been working in the field for the past few years, children's biographies now are much more realistic. I think they're much more honest. I think they treat their subjects with respect rather than reverence, and I think they show greater respect for the reader also.
Well, when your publisher, Clarion Books, asked you to do a presidential biography, why did you choose Abraham Lincoln when there's so many of them published?
I knew very little about Lincoln, and what I knew had intrigued me. I had learned about Lincoln as a child as a mythological, idealized figure, and he did not interest me much as a child. He didn't seem like a real human being. And then a few years ago, I read an essay by Mary McCarthy in which she mentioned that she admired Lincoln very much because of his intellect and his melancholy. The word melancholy caught my interest. It hinted at a side of Lincoln I wasn't aware of. Shortly after that, it was on Lincoln's birthday one year. The New York Times had a short article about the contents of Lincoln's pockets the morning he died after the assassination. And as I read about the contents of his pockets, a pocket knife, some old newspaper clippings, and also thought about Mary McCarthy's remark that Lincoln was melancholy, the man began to take on human dimensions. I became interested in him for the first time in my life. It was as though he were stepping down from the Lincoln Monument and changing from a marble statue to a flesh and blood human being before my eyes. So when Clarion asked if I wanted to do a presidential biography, Lincoln immediately came to mind, and I think the main reason is that I wanted to learn more about Lincoln myself. That's the main reason, my main reason for writing any nonfiction book, because I want to, I have a personal interest in exploring the subject.
What weaknesses did you find in Lincoln beside his melancholy?
Well, melancholy I didn't consider a weakness. An affliction, perhaps, but not a weakness. He was depressed a lot, but he had many weaknesses as a young man. He was indecisive. He was painfully shy. He was insecure, and he was a crybaby. He walked around feeling sorry for himself a great part of the time. And one of the fascinations of Lincoln's life story is watching him develop and overcome these faults, these weaknesses, and mature into a truly remarkable and powerful human being.
Well, how did the emancipation evolve as one of Lincoln's Civil War goals?
It wasn't one of his goals to start with.
I know.
His initial goal was to save the Union, and he said quite explicitly that his purpose was neither to extinguish slavery or to continue it, but to hold the Union together. However, as the Civil War continued, there was a terrible toll of bloodshed and suffering during the Civil War. This gave Lincoln a great deal of anguish. He thought about it a lot. He suffered personally, and he began to think that the Civil War was some sort of retribution for the sin of slavery. So his moral stance, he had always been against slavery, but he became passionately against it as the Civil War, with all of its bloodshed, progressed. And his advisors kept telling him that he had the executive powers under the war powers, under the emergency situation of the Civil War, to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. So he did it partly as a moral imperative and partly as a device to help speed the end of the war.
Well, how and where did you do your research on Lincoln?
I had a lot of fun doing the research. I followed the Lincoln Trail. I started out at Lincoln's log cabin birthplace in Kentucky. I visited his boyhood home in Indiana, went on to New Salem, Illinois, where he lived as a young man, to Springfield, where he married, raised a family, achieved a reputation as an attorney, and went on to Washington, to Ford's Theater, and to the rooming house across the street where he died. I tried to visit every significant Lincoln historic spot, and I think that added a lot to
Did you use library resources like the Illinois State Historical
I
Library in
used library
Springfield?
resources in many places, but I spent considerable time at the Illinois State Historical Library. In some cases looking at old letters, looking at original documents, more to get the feel of them and to get close to Lincoln than to discover any information that I didn't already have from published books. Tom Schwartz, the curator of the Lincoln collection at the Illinois State Historical Library, invited me into the vault one day. He said, "How would you like to enter the vault?" It was this enormous bank vault. We walked through the aisles of the library, narrow aisles past the shelves crammed with books, to the bank vault, and he twisted the combination lock and swung open this enormous door and said, "Let's step inside," where it was very quiet, very cool. The temperature, humidity, everything was precisely controlled. And Tom Schwartz began to show me scraps of paper, literally scraps of paper in some cases, where Lincoln had drawn some doodles or made some notes during a courtroom scene long ago. He showed me a letter to his wife, a draft, an original draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. And he explained that all of those original documents and scraps of paper had been specially treated. They had been dipped in something or other, a solution that takes all of the acid out of the paper. He held up a note with Lincoln's doodle scrawled on it and said, "This will last 1,000 years." So that was quite a thrill. I felt
must have been
very
a great
close
experience
to Lincoln at that time.
How many drafts of the book did you do?
Of Lincoln, I did about six
6
drafts. That's standard for a book like that.
Why did Lincoln not let the public use the term Abe with him?
Well, I know that he wouldn't. Why? I think that Lincoln spent a good part of his early life trying to overcome his log cabin origins. He was self-educated. It was hard to do. He was very proud of himself. And he rose from poverty, dirt farm poverty, to considerable affluence as an attorney. Actually, at the time Lincoln was elected president, he was quite a wealthy man because of his
It's interesting.
law practice and his extensive investments. He had invested in railroads and real estate. To an extent, there was a humble side of Lincoln, but he also respected his own achievement, and he couldn't stand the nickname Abe. And no one who knew him would dare call him Abe. It was Lincoln or Mr. Lincoln, inclering his wife Mary. She called him Mr. Lincoln.
I've heard that. She
interesting.
always Mr. Lincoln.
Right.
He cherished his dignity. In the Lincoln book, and in your books generally, which came first? The selection of the photographs or the writing?
It depends on the particular book. In the case of Lincoln, the writing came first, and then I went out and spent a considerable amount of time finding the photographs. However, I have done books such as Children of the Wild West, where I went out and researched and found the photographs first, laid them all out on the living room floor, and spent weeks playing with the photographs, moving them around, and developing a pattern before I began to write the manuscript.
I've heard of illustrators doing the mock-ups, but you're the first author I've heard of who does the mock-ups.
I do mock-ups for most books. That was one of the my motivations for writing children's books illustrated by photographs, because I wanted to have more control over the design of a book, over the rhythmic flow of a book. In a book like Lincoln, every single photograph in that book is keyed to a specific photograph, to a specific paragraph, rather. The photograph must appear on a certain double-page spread so that as the reader reads the relevant paragraph, the reader's eyes can move to the photograph, and the caption beneath the photograph ideally, and in most cases, supplies information that is not supplied within the body of the text. So the text and the photos are
they're in
supposed
perfect
to be
harmony.
integrated.
They truly are. And this is something to be admired in your books. When did you first discover the possibilities of archival photographs?
Well, I started out by doing a series of natural history books about animal behavior.
Right.
And where I discovered as I was doing these books that the photographs seemed much more credible. They had a more dramatic impact than an artist's drawings. For example, I did a book called Hanging On, How Animals Carry Their Young. And it's a series of short essays showing lions carrying their cubs, beavers carrying the beaver kits in their arms as they swim, bats flying with the infants clinging to their, the fur on their belly. And I wanted to use photographs for that book because I thought that they would be much more dramatic. And it was then that I discovered that if I went out and got my own photographs and coordinated the text in the photographs, that I would have control over the appearance of the book and the organic wholeness of the book that I would never have if an artist were doing illustrations. So I had done several natural history books using photographs, and one day a friend called and said, there's an exhibit at the New York Historical Society that will interest you. You really ought to run over there and see it, which I did. It was an exhibit called New York Street Kids, and it consisted of a lot of 19th century photographs mainly, showing children of all kinds growing up on the streets of New York. The photo exhibit commemorated the 125th anniversary of the Children's Aid Society in New York. A lot of the photographs came from the files of the Children's Aid Society. I was quite taken with the exhibit because, for example, I remember standing in front of a photograph of a newsboy and a newsgirl on a New York City street corner. Everything about the surroundings said that this was taken over 100 years ago. The architecture of the buildings, the clothing they were wearing, the horses and carriages passing by on the street. It was a different time, and yet the expressions on those children's faces, their expressions were timeless.
You're right.
And as I stood there looking at them, I realized that they had grown up, they had grown old, and they were dead and gone, and yet they were still children smiling at me from out of the past. So at that point I wanted to do a book using archival photographs, since I had already been doing the natural history books using photographs, and that resulted in a book called Immigrant Kids.
Yes. It's exciting to see a slice of life in the 1800s through actual photographs,
It is,
as
yeah.
in your Children of the Wild West, When you were gathering material for this book in historical societies and libraries, what other books did you conceive with similar photographs?
Well, actually, I conceived of Children of the Wild West as an idea the same day that I thought of doing Immigrant Kids.
I see.
I sat down and wrote out a list of book possibilities using old photographs, one of which was Children of the Wild West. However, finding the photographs of Children of the Wild West was much more difficult than finding them for Immigrant Kids, because when you go to a historical society, a museum, a library, any archival collection of photographs, you can't, there's no such category as Children of the Wild West.
Yeah.
And you have to
Sift through a lot,
sift
don't
through
you?
an awful lot in order to find appropriate photographs of children.
Authentic photographs in your book, Cowboys of the Wild West, help break the stereotype of movie cowboys as white heroes by showing black, Mexican, and American Indian cowboys. How frequently did American Indians work as cowboys?
There were a number of ranches in which all of the hired hands were American Indians. There were American Indian-owned ranches. I forget the exact statistic, and I don't think anyone knows for sure, but it's been estimated that probably 1 out of every 3 cowboys, authentic cowboys, during the days of the open range, the heyday of the American cowboy, about 1 out of every 3 were either black, Hispanic, or American Indian. There were a lot of black cowboys because they had been slaves. And the cowboy originated right after the Civil War. And you had these young black men who had been trained to work with cattle on plantations, or especially in Texas, which was a slave-owning state. And after the Civil War, when they were liberated, freed, they made ideal cowboys. They were very much in demand.
That's true. That's my home state, and I was raised right near the King Ranch. In your more recent book, Buffalo Hunt, you show photographs mainly of colored paintings by artists like George Catlin.
Right.
In this book and in Indian Chiefs, you stress the greed of the conqueror that almost resulted in genocide and made the buffalo extinct. Why was Indian Chiefs so difficult to write?
Well, Indian Chiefs was difficult to write because it deals with issues that were controversial at the time, which are extremely complex, which in some ways are impossible to simplify. Also, Indian Chiefs deals with several individuals coming from different tribes, speaking different languages, representing different cultures. And each of the chiefs and Indian chiefs fought an entirely different set of wars with the U.S. cavalry. So there were lots of complicated issues, many strands to tie together. It was a very, very difficult book to write.
Well done.
Yeah, and speaking of illustrations, one of the very few books of yours where you had illustrators' drawings was your first biography, Teenagers Who Make History.
Who Made History,
Now,
yeah.
why did you write that book? What caused you to write that?
That was my first book,
Yes.
Teenagers Who Made History. I hadn't really anticipated becoming a writer of children's books.
Oh.
I was working as a journalist and then as a publicist for several television shows when I came across an article in the New York Times one morning, and it was about a 16-year-old blind youngster who had invented a Braille typewriter. And I thought, that's wonderful, that's remarkable, a Braille typewriter. And then as I kept reading, I learned that the Braille system itself had been invented by another 16-year-old who was also blind, Louis Braille. And I was so struck by that I began to think about it, and I eventually thought of doing a book called Teenagers Who Made History. Now, because of the nature of the book, because of the subject, it's obviously a book for young adults. And that's how it was published. It was published by Holiday House as a book for young adults. So on the morning of publication, I woke up and I thought, wow, here I am. I'm a writer of children's books. So let's see if I can try it again.
Why did you choose Jules Verne for your second biography?
Well, my second book was called 2,000 Years of Space Travel. And it was about the idea of space travel, from the time of certain ancient Greek storytellers who spun tales about trips to the moon, right up to the launching of the first rockets. It was, in a sense, a history of an idea. And of course, Jules Verne figured very importantly. I had a chapter on Jules Verne in 2,000 Years of Space Travel. So when I finished that, and it came time to do a third book, I was all set up to do Jules Verne.
Well, how did you do the research on Jules Verne? You go to Europe?
I went to Europe. I visited Jules Verne's birthplace. I visited Brittany, where he spent a great part of his early life. And I read all of the biographies in English. My French was not good enough to do research in original French, but there have been quite a number of biographies in English on Jules Verne. And I read every book that Jules Verne wrote, a number of which are obtainable only in the rare book room of the Library of Congress. So after applying for permission to do research and being admitted into this wood-paneled inner sanctum and sitting at this wonderful old oak table, they would bring out one book at a time, and I would sit there and read it, and then they would bring me the next one. That's how I researched Jules Verne.
Well, it's a wonderful book, a timeless book.
Thank you.
Now, after your biographies, you started doing a series of animal behavior books?
I had done several biographies, well, I think 3 or 4 biographies, and a couple of other books of that nature. And I knew very little about animal behavior at the time, but a friend of mine who was a high school biology teacher.
We've run out of time.
Have we? That's a story for another time.
Good.
Okay. I would just say that they are superb, and my favorite one is Can Bears Predict Earthquakes? Unsolved Mysteries of Animal Behavior, published in 1982. I do want to thank you very much.
Jackie, thank you.
In 1988, your Lincoln, a photobiography, won the Jefferson Cup Award. That same book made you the first author of nonfiction in 32 years to win the Newbery Medal. 6 of his books have won the American Library Association, have been considered American Library Association notable books for children. One of these, Children of the Wild West, received the Western Heritage Award from the National Cowboy Hall of Fame. His most recent book, Buffalo Hunt, won the Golden Kite Honor Book Award of the Society of Children's Book Writers and was considered one of the best books of the year by School Library Journal, the American Library Association, Book List, both Parents and Parenting magazines, and the Library of Congress. You were predestined for a literary life. After all, your mother and father met in a bookstore. Thank you for coming.
La 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 la.